You know, the factory you have, the machinery, the equipment you use. um, You have real estate, buildings and land. These two assets, these are examples of so-called tangible assets. Tangible means they have a physical presence, physical existence. A computer is a tangible asset because independent of anything, despite whatever quantum mechanics may tell you, it has its own reality. Okay? At the level of electrons, that's a different story. It's fascinating. I'm not even sure that there is such a thing as an objective reality, given what quantum theory tells you. But at least as a good approximation, these things are real. Okay? And they have physical existence. But there are also intangible assets. These assets have a value, but they don't have a physical existence. I'm not talking about something like purchasing a stock. In the old days, you actually had stock certificates. You don't have those anymore, but we have a computer record. And in fact, by law, if you ask the company, they will have to print you a stock certificate. Some people do it for posterity, but it doesn't matter. It's the electronic record that matters. Similarly, bonds are only listed electronically, but they have a physical existence. Again, in the old days, you had a paper bond. They even had little detachable coupons. You clip those coupons, took them to the bank, and they paid you for quarterly or semi-annual interest payments. These are assets like copyrights, patents, you know, building and exploration rights, etc. If you actually paid something for it, uh, they will be listed. But if your company came up with the invention, you know, there's the company that I'm investing in. At this point, I'm losing money, but these guys are doing software and hardware for self-driving industrial vehicles like forklifts. Man, this thing was up 30% in the morning. I sold some of it, but they just had a piece of news. Oops. They just secured a patent. That means they came up with an invention. They applied to the patent office and they got it. They haven't paid anything for it. Technically speaking, it cost them money because in order to develop that patent, people worked on it. They pay those people. But when accountants have no systematic way of attaching a value to something, they choose to attach a value of zero. So that's not going to be listed as an asset in companies. And this company right now is worth about probably $7 million market cap. I would be very surprised if those patents alone would be worth less than 100 million. But you don't see that in the books. So these are intangible assets. But sometimes you actually buy a patent, you acquire a patent, then you go ahead and list it in your books. Same thing applies to copyrights. You know, you may purchase exploration rights for oil in the Gulf, right? Gulf of Mexico. There is no physical existence to it. In fact, you may not even use that. but it has the value. If you wanted to sell that, you could sell it. And obviously, you purchased it, or you pay the government to get those rights, what have you. There is one peculiar item among those intangibles. It's called goodwill. Anybody knows what that is by any chance? It has nothing to do with will or being good. When a company purchases an asset or acquires an asset, it pays something for it. Example, back in 2004, I believe, Google bought YouTube for $1.6 billion. Dollars. It's probably the smartest acquisition ever in the history of acquisitions. Because right now, YouTube is responsible for about one third of Google's value, at least revenue. And Google is worth $2 trillion now. So if you go just from that, value of YouTube is at least half a trillion dollars, but they paid only 1.6. But at the time, YouTube was basically two guys that are in their garage. I mean, they had some money from venture capital firms and stuff. But if you looked at their books, their net asset value was only $500 million. So Google bought something that was Google paid 1.6 million. When you acquire that asset, you put all of that into your own balance sheet, but it looks like that added only $500 million to your net worth. But in accounting, we do double entry accounting. Everything has to add up. If I paid $1.6 billion and I got something only worth $0.5 billion in the books, what happens to that 1.1? Am I going to list it as a loss? No. I'm going to create an asset called goodwill. Goodwill is uh, excess of uh, acquisition cost over and above the book value of acquired assets. So what Google did, it actually listed $1.1 billion as goodwill. Right? If we went to Google's balance sheet, let me see. It may not be here, but there will be goodwill. Or maybe Apple has some. Anyway, in the old days, goodwill was subject to 40-year amortization. That means every year you wrote off 2.5% of that as amortization expense. That was kind of a band-aid solution. In 2006, FSB, Financial Standards Board, realized that goodwill is something that may change. They said it is subject to test of asset impairment. So unless you realize that the value of the thing you bought is much less now, you leave the goodwill at its original cost. But if you realize that, suppose YouTube experiment didn't work, and at best Google could have gotten maybe $500 million for it, and they would have had to write off that 1.1 goodwill because the value of the asset is impaired now. There's actually a real example of that. Have you guys heard of something called MySpace? Yeah, it was Facebook before Facebook, essentially. And nowadays it's very confined. Uh, all the creepy people outside of dark web. Uh, Wall Street Journal bought MySpace for $500 million, I think in 2005 or something. Do you think MySpace is worth anything now? No. In fact, years later, after Facebook came about and pretty much put everybody else in the trash, they realized that this is not worth anything, so they recognized impairment of goodwill, and that was it. Now let's talk about the liability side. Let's see here. Total liabilities are current liabilities plus long-term debt. And we're going to use the abbreviations CL and LTD for that. Current liabilities are uh, obligations of the firm that are due within a year. And that typically short-term debts, accounts payable, and generic other current liabilities. Short-term debt means debt you have, not payables. Payables are trade credits your suppliers provide you. Um, there is no mutation in English language, so T doesn't become a D. There are a lot of mutations in, for example, a lot of Celtic languages, such as Welsh. Depending upon the grammatical context, a D could become a double D.